History is a story of endings, of empires that rise, dominate, and inevitably fall. For 1,000 years, one name stood above all others as the very definition of power and civilization: Rome. From the misty forests of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, its legions marched, its laws governed, and its culture shone as a beacon. But no beacon can burn forever. The decline was not a single event, but a slow, creeping sickness. A crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire tear itself apart with endless civil wars. The treasury, drained by constant conflict and bloated bureaucracy, collapsed. The currency was debased into worthless bronze. Barbarian tribes once held at bay now hammered at the frontiers: Goths, Vandals, Franks. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. The Eternal City, Rome itself, was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. The psychological blow was immense. The world held its breath. The final end, when it came, was not a bang, but a whimper. In 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus. No new emperor was named. The imperial insignia were packed up and sent east, a formal admission that the story of Rome in the West was over. The light had gone out. But this was not the end of the story. It was not even the beginning of the end, because in the East the Roman Empire had not fallen. It had endured. Richer, more populous, and better defended, this eastern half stood as its brother crumbled. This is the story of the empire that survived, the empire that carried the legacy of Rome for another 1,000 years. They called themselves Romans, but history would give them another name: the Byzantines. This is the story of the empire that refused to die. The survival of the East was no accident. It was a masterstroke of vision and geography. Our story truly begins 2 centuries earlier, with an emperor who sought to unify a fractured empire: Constantine the Great. In 330 CE, he made a decision that would alter the course of history. He would found a new capital, a new Rome. He chose a location of unparalleled strategic genius, the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium. It was a triangular peninsula, protected on 2 sides by the sea, commanding the Bosphorus Strait, the sole waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. All trade, from the grain of Egypt to the silks of the Far East, had to pass through its gates. While the West's economy withered, the East grew fabulously wealthy, its gold coin, the solidus, becoming the reserve currency of the ancient world. Constantine poured immense resources into his new city. He built forums, palaces, a colossal hippodrome for chariot races, and most importantly, he consecrated it as a Christian capital from its very inception, a stark contrast to the pagan traditions of old Rome. This was not just a new administrative center. It was the heart of a new Christian Roman identity. But a capital, no matter how wealthy, is worthless if it cannot be defended. In the 5th century, as the Western Empire was being terrorized by Attila the Hun, the East faced the same threat. In response, the regent Anthemius, ruling for the young Emperor Theodosius II, commissioned one of the greatest feats of military engineering in human history: the Theodosian Walls. They were a masterpiece of defense in depth. An attacker first had to cross a wide, deep moat, which could be flooded. If they crossed it, they faced the low outer wall manned by archers. If they took that, they had to cross a wide terrace, a killing ground, to face the main event, the inner wall. It was nearly 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded with almost 100 towers, each a small fortress in its own right. When Attila the Hun and his horde arrived, they took one look at this impenetrable barrier and decided to turn west, towards the softer targets of Gaul and Italy. The walls worked. They were the shield of the empire, a symbol of its permanence. For 1,000 years they would stand, repelling army after army, allowing the civilization within to flourish while the world outside burned. waged within the city walls, a war not of swords, but of ideas, a war for the very soul of God. In this new Christian empire, theology was not a matter for quiet contemplation. It was politics, it was passion, it was the subject of vicious debate in the streets and in the palace. The central question was one that threatened to tear the empire apart. What is the true nature of Jesus Christ? One powerful faction, the Arians, argued that Christ, as the Son, must have been created by the Father and was therefore subordinate to him. To their opponents, the followers of the Nicene Creed, this was a monstrous heresy. They declared that Christ was co-eternal and of the same substance as the Father. The debate raged for decades, with emperors choosing sides and bishops exiling one another. Other disputes flared, like Nestorianism, which argued for a separation between Christ's human and divine natures. To the Orthodox, this was equally unacceptable. This was the inheritance of the Eastern Roman Empire, a civilization defined by its contradictions. It was a Roman state that spoke Greek, a Christian empire that treasured pagan philosophy, and a society that would fight to the death over a single iota in a theological text. It was a fortress of immense wealth and unbreachable walls, yet it was internally fractured by debates that threatened to shatter its unity. It stood alone, a ghost of a greater past, yet holding the seeds of a vibrant future. By the dawn of the 6th century, the stage was set for an emperor who would not just try to settle these debates, but who would seek to impose his will on the heavens and the earth. An emperor who would attempt to reclaim the glory of old Rome. His name was Justinian. In the year 527, a new emperor ascended the throne in Constantinople. He was not a man born to the purple, but a peasant's nephew from the Latin-speaking Balkans. His name was Justinian. Contemporaries described him as the emperor who never slept, a man of restless energy and terrifying ambition. He was a devout Christian, a student of Roman history, and a man possessed by a single all-consuming dream, Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. He looked at the map not as it was, but as it should be. He saw the lands of the West, Italy, Africa, Spain, not as lost kingdoms, but as occupied Roman provinces waiting to be liberated. At his side was his wife, a woman as unlikely and ambitious as himself, Theodora, a former actress and courtesan, a profession considered utterly scandalous. She possessed an intellect of steel and a courage that would soon be tested. Together, this peasant's nephew and the actress from the gutter would attempt to remake the world. Justinian's grand ambitions were almost extinguished by the very source of Constantinople's entertainment, the Hippodrome. The city's populace was fanatically divided between two chariot racing teams, the Blues, or Venetoi, who were generally orthodox and from the upper classes, and the Greens, the Prasinoi, who often held monophysite beliefs and were from the lower classes. These were not mere sports teams. They were a combination of political parties and violent street gangs. In January of 532, after the arrest of several of their members for a murder, the Blues and Greens did the unthinkable. They united. As Justinian presided over the races, their taunts turned from each other to him. The chant began, a low rumble that grew to a deafening roar that shook the foundations of the arena. Nika, 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 conquer, victory. The riot spilled from the Hippodrome into the city streets. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. The great church of Hagia Sophia, the Senate House, the public baths, all were turned to ash. Disgruntled senators, seeing their chance, rallied the mob and crowned a new emperor, Hypatius, the nephew of a former ruler. Barricaded in the great palace, Justinian's nerve broke. His advisors urged him to flee, to take the imperial treasure and escape by sea. The ships were waiting. It was in this moment of total collapse that Empress Theodora, the former actress who had clawed her way to the throne, showed her iron will. She addressed the council, her voice cutting through the panic. She spoke of how she would rather die an empress than live as a fugitive. She concluded with the immortal words that changed history. "Royalty," she declared, "is a fine burial shroud." Her courage was like a physical blow. Shamed and emboldened, Justinian stayed. He turned to his most trusted general, the quiet and brilliant Belisarius. A ruthless plan was hatched. While the mob and their new emperor celebrated in the Hippodrome, Belisarius and his personal guard slipped through the palace entrance to the arena. At the same time, another general, Mundus, blocked the main gates. The trap was sprung. The emperor's soldiers, mostly loyal Germanic mercenaries, drew their swords and fell upon the unarmed crowd. The exits were blocked. There was no escape. The massacre was brutally efficient. By sunset, the floor of the Hippodrome was slick with the blood of over 30,000 citizens. Justinian's throne was secure, cemented in blood and fire. With his power absolute, Justinian unleashed his dream upon the world. He gave Belisarius his orders: reclaim Africa from the Vandals and Italy from the Ostrogoths. The Vandalic War was a stunning success, a lightning campaign that took less than a year. Belisarius marched into Carthage in triumph, restoring North Africa to the empire after a century of barbarian rule. Italy, however, would be a different story. The Gothic War would become a two-decade quagmire of brutal sieges, betrayals, and Pyrrhic victories. The ancient heartland of the empire was bled white. Rome itself was captured and recaptured 5 times, its population plummeting, its aqueducts cut, its great monuments left as hollow shells. Belisarius, starved of men and resources, performed military miracles, but the cost was immense. By the end, the Roman eagle once again flew over Rome and Ravenna, but the Italy Justinian liberated was a shadow of its former self, a land of ghosts. While his armies fought, Justinian waged a war on a different front, a war against legal chaos. 1,000 years of Roman laws had become a contradictory, unworkable mess. He commissioned the jurist Tribonian to undertake a monumental task: to collect, edit, and codify all of Roman law. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was Justinian's most enduring conquest, a gift of logic and order that would become the foundation of countless legal systems to this day. From the ashes of the Nika Riots, Justinian would raise his masterpiece. He summoned 2 Greek scientists, Anthemius of Tralles, a physicist, and Isidore of Miletus, a mathematician, and gave them a challenge: build a church grander than anything the world had ever seen. They abandoned the traditional Roman basilica design. Using a revolutionary architectural technique known as pendentives, they did the impossible. They placed a perfectly round dome over a square chamber. To the observer below, the 40 windows ringing the base of the dome obscured the supports, making it seem as if the Great Dome was not resting on the building at all, but was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. When it was completed in just under 6 years, Justinian walked into it for the first time. Surrounded by acres of gold mosaic, bathed in a light that seemed to come from another world, the emperor was overwhelmed. He spread his arms and whispered, "Solomon, I have outdone thee." The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, would be the heart of Orthodox Christianity for the next 900 years. But as Justinian's empire reached its zenith, a new arrival appeared in the port of Pelusium in Egypt, carried by rats on grain ships. It was an invisible enemy, one that no wall could stop and no army could fight: Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. The historian Procopius, an eyewitness, described its horrors: the sudden fever, the delirium, and the telltale swellings, the buboes, in the groin and armpits. Death was swift and agonizing. The plague reached Constantinople in 541 and exploded. At its peak, it killed 10,000 people a day. There was no room to bury the dead. Bodies were dumped in the sea or stacked in the towers of the city walls. Society broke down. The economy collapsed. The fields lay fallow. Justinian himself caught the plague and fell into a coma, but miraculously, he survived. When he awoke to a different world. The empire was a graveyard. An estimated third of its population was gone. The armies he had sent to Italy were hollowed out. The treasury was empty. The dream of restoration was dead, drowned in a sea of pestilence. Justinian would live for another 2 decades, a grim, isolated figure ruling over a haunted empire. He left behind a law code that would last forever and a cathedral that touched the heavens. But he also left an empire that was bankrupt, overstretched, and fundamentally broken. The glorious, ambitious dream had been achieved, but the cost would be paid in the darkness that was to come. The successors to Justinian inherited a hollowed-out empire. The plague had left the provinces depopulated and the army undermanned. The treasury was empty. In the east, the empire's ancient rival, the Sasanian Persian Empire, saw its chance. Under their ambitious king, Khosrow II, they sought to not merely defeat Rome, but to annihilate it. What followed was a tide of devastation unlike anything seen in centuries. The Persian armies poured across the frontier. Syria fell, Mesopotamia fell. Then, in 614, came the most soul-crushing blow of all. The Persians captured the holy city of Jerusalem. They massacred its inhabitants and carried away Christendom's most sacred relic, the true cross, upon which Jesus was believed to have been crucified. The psychological shock was immense. It felt as though God himself had abandoned the Roman Empire. The deluge continued. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, was conquered, cutting off the grain supply to Constantinople. The Persians marched through Anatolia and soon stood on the shores of the Bosphorus, looking across the water at the capital itself. The empire was on its knees, reduced to little more than the city, a few islands, and scraps of territory in the Balkans. Annihilation seemed inevitable. In this desperate hour, a new emperor seized the throne, Heraclius. Facing an impossible situation, he made a series of daring choices. He stripped the churches of their silver and gold to pay for a new army. He then did something no emperor had done in centuries. He took the field himself, not as a politician, but as a general. Framing the conflict as a holy war to reclaim the true cross, Heraclius sailed his army not to face the Persians head-on, but deep into their own heartland, a high-stakes gamble to cut them off from behind. For 6 years he campaigned relentlessly, leading his men through grueling marches and brilliant battles. Finally, in 627, near the ruins of ancient Nineveh, Heraclius shattered the main Persian army. The Persian king was overthrown and his successor sued for peace. Heraclius returned to Constantinople a hero. He marched in triumph into Jerusalem and personally restored the true cross to its shrine. It was a victory of epic proportions, a seemingly miraculous reversal of fortune. The ancient rivalry that had lasted for 700 years was over. Rome had won, but the triumph would be tragically short-lived. As the two exhausted superpowers, Rome and Persia, licked their wounds, a new force erupted from the deserts of Arabia, united by the new faith of Islam. It was a hurricane of faith and steel. The Byzantine border guards, accustomed to small-scale raids, were utterly unprepared for the disciplined, zealous, and brilliantly led armies that now swarmed into their territory. Heraclius, old and sick, sent a massive imperial army to crush the invaders. At the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, a combination of a blinding sandstorm and superior Arab cavalry tactics resulted in the complete annihilation of the Byzantine force. The defeat was a cataclysm. With its main army destroyed, the empire was defenseless. The recently reconquered provinces of Syria and Palestine, including Jerusalem, were lost again, this time forever. Then, Egypt, the jewel of the East, fell. The Arab armies swept across North Africa. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, was now a war zone. The empire that had just stood victorious was suddenly reduced to a rump state. a core of Anatolia and the Balkans, fighting for its very life. The new Umayyad Caliphate, now ruling a vast empire from Damascus, set its sights on the ultimate prize, Constantinople itself. Twice, in 674 and again in 717, massive Arab armies and navies threw themselves at the city's walls. These were not mere raids, they were sieges of annihilation, meant to extinguish the Roman Empire once and for all. And twice, the city held. It held because of the unbreakable Theodosian walls, the iron will of its people, and a terrifying secret weapon, Greek fire. A closely guarded state secret, this liquid incendiary was a marvel of chemical engineering. Pumped through siphons mounted on the prows of Byzantine ships, it would erupt in a jet of flame that could not be extinguished by water. It clung to enemy ships and sailors, turning the sea itself into an inferno. By repelling these sieges, Constantinople did more than save itself. It acted as the bulwark of Europe, halting the seemingly unstoppable Islamic expansion from the east. The city became the Shield of Christendom. To survive in this new hostile world, the empire had to transform. The old Roman provincial system was replaced by the theme system, dividing Anatolia into military districts and granting land to soldiers in exchange for service. The empire became a militarized, defensive state. But the greatest transformation was internal. Racked by plague, war, and the loss of its holiest sites, the empire began to ask itself a terrible question. Have we angered God? A new religious movement led by Emperor Leo III provided an answer. They claimed that God was punishing the empire for the sin of idolatry, the worship of religious images or icons. What followed was iconoclasm, a century-long civil war over the soul of Byzantium. On the emperor's orders, soldiers marched into churches, tearing down icons, plastering over mosaics, and destroying priceless works of art. Those who defended the icons, the iconodules, were persecuted, exiled, or worse. The empire turned its fury inward. The state that emerged from this dark age was a shadow of its former self. It was smaller, poorer, and relentlessly besieged. But it was also tougher, more resilient, and more unified in its orthodox faith, which would eventually restore the icons. It had stared into the abyss and survived. It had refused to die. And now, it was ready for a renaissance. The end of the 9th century ushered in a new dynasty, and with it a new golden age. They were the Macedonians, a line of formidable soldiers and able administrators who would drag the empire from its defensive crouch and forge it into an offensive juggernaut. The dynasty's founder was a man of incredible origins, Basil I. A peasant of Armenian stock, he came to Constantinople with nothing, and through a combination of immense strength, cunning, and ruthless ambition, he rose from stable boy to co-emperor, eventually murdering his benefactor to seize the throne for himself. Under Basil and his successors, the tide began to turn. The empire was no longer just surviving, it was expanding. The armies were retrained and re-equipped. The bureaucracy was reformed. The long, slow work of reconquest began, pushing back against the Arab caliphates in the east and asserting dominance over the Slavic kingdoms in the west. The Roman eagle was learning to fly again. The 10th century was an age of warrior emperors. Men like Nikephoros Phocas, a grim and ascetic general known as the Pale Death of the Saracens, and the brilliant, charismatic John Tzimiskes, led the armies from the front. They reconquered vast territories in the east, taking back key cities like Antioch and Aleppo. They pushed deep into Syria and Palestine, restoring the empire's borders to a state not seen in 300 years. But the greatest challenge lay to the west in the Balkans. Here, a powerful Bulgarian empire had risen, ruled by the ambitious Tsar Samuel. For decades, the Bulgarians were a thorn in the empire's side, raiding its lands and challenging its supremacy. The stage was set for a final, brutal confrontation, a war that would be defined by the will of one of the most ruthless emperors in Roman history. His name was Basil II. He was not like his predecessors. He cared little for the pomp and ceremony of the court. He was a soldier, first and last, grim, ascetic, and possessed of an unbreakable will. He spent nearly his entire 49-year reign on campaign, and his lifelong obsession was the complete and utter destruction of the Bulgarian Empire. The war was a brutal, grinding affair that lasted for over 30 years. Finally, in 1014 at the Battle of Kleidion, Basil trapped and annihilated the main Bulgarian army. But victory was not enough. He was determined to break the Bulgarian spirit forever. He took 15,000 prisoners and ordered them all blinded. He then divided them into groups of 100, leaving a single prisoner in each group with one eye, so that they could lead their comrades home. The story goes that when Tsar Samuel saw his mutilated army return, he died of a heart attack on the spot. The Bulgarian Empire collapsed and was fully annexed. Basil II had earned his terrifying nickname, Bulgar-Oktanos, the Bulgar-Slayer. By his death, the empire was larger, richer, and more feared than it had been in half a millennium. With the borders secure and the treasury overflowing, culture blossomed. This was a renaissance before the Italian Renaissance. In the scriptoriums of Constantinople, scholars painstakingly preserved and copied the ancient texts of Greece and Rome. Plato, Aristotle, Thucydides, saving them from being lost to history. Art flourished, with stunning mosaics and intricate ivory carvings reaching new heights of sophistication. This cultural power projected far beyond the empire's borders. Missionaries like the brothers Cyril and Methodius traveled north to the Slavic lands. They not only spread Orthodox Christianity, but also created a new alphabet for the Slavic languages, the Glagolitic script, which would evolve into the Cyrillic alphabet still used today across Eastern Europe and Russia. The conversion of Vladimir the Great, ruler of the Kievan Rus, to Orthodox Christianity was a pivotal moment, tying the destiny of the rising Russian civilization directly to Constantinople. But even at the height of its power, a crack that had been forming for centuries finally split the foundation of Christendom. The churches of Rome in the west and Constantinople in the east had been drifting apart for years. They disagreed on matters of doctrine, such as the Filioque clause, a debate over the nature of the Holy Spirit. They clashed over clerical marriage, but most of all, they clashed over power. Was the Pope in Rome the supreme head of all Christians, as he claimed, or was he merely the first among equals, as the Patriarch of Constantinople insisted? In 1054, these tensions boiled over. The Pope sent a hot-headed legate, Cardinal Humbert, to Constantinople to resolve the disputes. The negotiations collapsed into mutual insults. On a Saturday afternoon, Humbert marched into the Hagia Sophia in the middle of the service and slammed a papal bull of excommunication down on the main altar, condemning the Patriarch and his followers. In response, the Patriarch promptly excommunicated Humbert and his mission. At the time, it may have seemed like just another political and theological spat, but it was final. The Great Schism had officially occurred. The Christian world was now permanently divided between the Roman Catholic West and the Orthodox East. This bitter divorce would have catastrophic consequences, turning former brothers into suspicious rivals and eventually into mortal enemies. The Golden Age was over, though no one knew it yet. The death of Basil the Bulgar-Slayer left a power vacuum. A series of weak, incompetent emperors followed, more interested in courtly intrigue than military matters. They neglected the army, debased the currency, and allowed the powerful theme system to decay. At this precise moment of weakness, a new and formidable enemy appeared in the east. They were the Seljuk Turks, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia who had recently converted to Sunni Islam. They were masters of horse archery and hit-and-run tactics, a style of warfare the Byzantines were ill-prepared to counter. In 1071, the well-intentioned but militarily rash emperor Romanos IV Diogenes gathered a massive imperial army to drive the Seljuks out of Anatolia once and for all. He met the forces of the Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, near the town of Manzikert. The battle was a cataclysm. Due to a combination of poor scouting, tactical blunders, and the outright treachery of a rival Byzantine commander who pulled his forces out at a critical moment, the imperial army was enveloped and shattered. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years, a Roman emperor was captured in battle. Manzikert was more than a defeat, it was the breaking of the dam. In the ensuing decade of civil war and chaos, the empire's control over Anatolia, its primary source of soldiers, grain, and wealth, completely evaporated. Turkish tribes poured into the vacuum, and the heartland of the empire was lost. The state was on the brink of total collapse. In this desperate hour, salvation came in the form of one of the most brilliant political dynasties in Roman history, the Komnenoi. In 1081, a young general named Alexios I Komnenos seized the throne. He inherited a nightmare. The Turks were at the gates, Norman adventurers were invading from Italy, and the treasury was completely empty. Through sheer diplomatic genius, ruthless pragmatism, and tireless energy, Alexios began the Komnenian Restoration. He reformed the currency, rebuilt the army around a core of loyal mercenaries, including the elite Varangian Guard, and played his enemies off one another with masterful skill. He fought desperately to hold the line, but he knew he could not reconquer Anatolia alone. He needed help. And so, he made a decision that would irrevocably change the history of the world. He sent an appeal to the Pope in the West, Urban II, asking for a small force of elite, heavily armored mercenary knights to help him fight the Turks. Alexios asked for a regiment. Pope Urban II launched a holy war. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, the Pope delivered a fiery sermon, calling on the knights of Christendom to cease their endless infighting and direct their aggression towards liberating the Holy Lands from the Muslims. The response was overwhelming, far beyond anything the Pope or Alexios could have imagined. The First Crusade was not the disciplined mercenary force Alexios had hoped for. It was a chaotic migration of nobles, knights, peasants, and fanatics, all marching east for their own reasons: piety, glory, wealth, or adventure. When they arrived at the gates of Constantinople, Alexios was horrified. He saw not a manageable army, but a dangerous, unpredictable mob that could just as easily turn on his own city. With masterful diplomacy, he managed the Crusader leaders, extracting oaths of fealty and promising to return any former imperial lands they reconquered. He ferried them across the Bosphorus and used them as a battering ram against the Turks, successfully recapturing key coastal cities like Nicaea. But a deep and bitter mistrust was born. The Crusaders saw the Byzantines as effete, treacherous, and cowardly for not fighting alongside them. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as barbaric, greedy, and untrustworthy thugs. Over the next century, this relationship soured completely. The Second and Third Crusades only deepened the hostility. But the final, ultimate betrayal came at the turn of the 13th century. The Fourth Crusade was assembled, ostensibly to attack the center of Muslim power in Egypt. But the Crusaders lacked the funds to pay the powerful Republic of Venice for naval transport. The cunning, blind Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, saw an opportunity. He offered to defer the debt if the Crusaders would first help him destroy Venice's commercial rival, the Christian city of Zara. The Crusaders agreed. Then, a deposed Byzantine prince arrived with an even more tempting offer: divert the crusade to Constantinople, restore him to the throne, and he would pay their debts, fund their holy war, and submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of the Pope. Driven by a toxic cocktail of greed, religious animosity, and political manipulation, the Christian army from the West turned on the greatest Christian city in the world. In 1204, the Crusaders breached the sea walls. For 3 days, the city was subjected to an orgy of destruction that horrified the world. Priceless bronze statues were melted down for coin. The great library was burned. Holy relics were stolen and shipped back to the West. Palaces were looted, and thousands of civilians were slaughtered. The nuns in their convents were violated. A prostitute was placed on the Patriarch's throne in the Hagia Sophia, singing bawdy songs. The sack of 1204 was the mortal blow. It was an act of civilizational suicide inflicted by brothers in faith. The city that had been the Shield of Christendom for 900 years, the repository of classical knowledge, the wealthiest metropolis on earth, was shattered. The Roman Empire was, for the first time, truly broken. This was a wound from which it would never, ever recover. The sack of 1204 shattered the empire. The Crusaders and Venetians carved it up, establishing a Latin empire in Constantinople. But even in this darkest of moments, the Roman spirit refused to die. Byzantine nobles fled and established several successor states, governments in exile that kept the flame of Roman identity alive. The most powerful of these was the Empire of Nicaea. For over half a century, the Nicaean emperors plotted their return. They rebuilt their strength, engaged in shrewd diplomacy, and waited for their moment. That moment came in 1261. In a stroke of incredible luck, a small force of soldiers led by General Alexios Strategopoulos found Constantinople almost completely undefended. They slipped into the city at night. The last Latin emperor fled in a panic, and the Byzantine eagle standard was once again raised over the walls. The emperor, Michael VIII Palaiologos, made his formal entry soon after, but it was no triumph. He wept as he saw the state of his capital. The palaces were crumbling, the great churches were stripped of their wealth, and the population was a fraction of its former glory. The empire was restored, but it was a ghost in its own palace, a small, impoverished state, surrounded by powerful and ambitious enemies. The final 2 centuries of the Byzantine Empire were a long, slow, agonizing goodbye. The restored Paleologan dynasty was beset by constant, ruinous civil wars, with brother fighting brother and father fighting son for control of a shrinking prize. The economy was in shambles, completely dependent on the rival maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, who treated Constantinople like their own personal colony. And in the east, a new power had risen from the ashes of the old Seljuk Sultanate. They were the Ottoman Turks, named for their founder, Osman. Disciplined, zealous, and brilliantly led, they began a relentless conquest. They swept through what was left of Byzantine Anatolia. Then, in the mid-14th century, they did what the Arabs could not. They crossed into Europe, establishing a permanent foothold. One by one, the Byzantine cities in the Balkans fell. The Ottomans established their new capital at Adrianople, deep inside former Roman territory. The circle tightened. By the early 15th century, the once mighty Roman Empire was reduced to little more than the city of Constantinople itself, a few islands, and a small despotate in southern Greece. It was an island in a vast Ottoman sea, surviving only on the Sultan's sufferance. In 1451, the final act began. A new Sultan ascended the Ottoman throne, the 21-year-old Mehmed II. Highly intelligent, speaking multiple languages, and utterly ruthless, Mehmed was obsessed with a single goal: the conquest of Constantinople. To him, it was not just a strategic objective, but the fulfillment of a prophetic destiny. He famously declared, "I want only one thing. Give me Constantinople." Facing him was the last Roman emperor, Constantine the 11th, Palaiologos. A brave and competent soldier, Constantine knew his situation was hopeless. He sent desperate pleas for help to the west, but received only empty promises and demands that he submit his church to the authority of the Pope, a move that would have caused a riot in his own city. Mehmed prepared for the siege with meticulous care. His masterstroke was the hiring of a Hungarian engineer named Orban, who offered to build him cannons of a size and power the world had never seen before. The stage was set for the final confrontation between the dying old world and the vibrant, ambitious new one. In April of 1453, the siege began. Mehmed's army numbered over 80,000 men, including his elite Janissary infantry. Against this colossal force, Constantine could muster fewer than 7,000 defenders, a mix of his own subjects and a few hundred brave Genoese and Venetian volunteers, led by the heroic soldier of fortune, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. For 53 days, this tiny force held out against overwhelming odds in one of history's most heroic last stands. They fought on the ancient Theodosian walls as Mehmed's supercannons pounded them day and night, reducing sections of the legendary fortifications to rubble. Each night, the defenders would work frantically to repair the breaches. The Ottoman fleet tried to force its way into the city's harbor, the Golden Horn, but was held back by a great defensive chain. In a stroke of genius, Mehmed had his ships dragged overland on greased logs, bypassing the chain and putting ships into the harbor. The city was now completely surrounded. On the final night, knowing the end was near, a solemn final Christian service was held in the Hagia Sophia. Orthodox priests, Catholic cardinals, soldiers, and citizens stood side by side, praying together as the sounds of the Ottoman army preparing for the final assault echoed outside. Before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault began. Waves of Ottoman troops threw themselves at the walls. The exhausted defenders fought with the courage of despair, but they were simply overwhelmed. Justinian, the heart of the defense, was mortally wounded, and the line began to break. Seeing that all was lost, Constantine XI Palaiologos reportedly declared, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." He cast aside his imperial regalia so that he could not be distinguished from any other soldier, and led his last remaining men in a final charge into the oncoming sea of Janissaries. He died fighting, a Roman emperor dying as a Roman soldier. The Ottoman flags were raised over the walls. After 2,200 years of history, from the founding of the city of Rome to the fall of its final successor, the Roman Empire was over. The Byzantine Empire is often remembered as a footnote, a strange, decadent sequel to the grandeur of Rome. But its legacy is all around us. For 1,000 years, its walls and its armies acted as the shield of Europe, protecting the developing West from wave after wave of Eastern invaders. Its scholars preserved the priceless knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, which would later fuel the Italian Renaissance. Its legal code forms the bedrock of modern justice. Its faith shaped the culture of Eastern Europe. This was the empire that lived for a millennium after its own death sentence. It was the Roman phoenix constantly reborn from the ashes of defeat. It was the empire that faced down Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, and Turks. It was the empire that, against all odds, simply refused to die. And in its story of survival, resilience, and enduring legacy, it remains one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history.